Welcome to Knowledge Cast. This is a look into the world of knowledge management, information management, data management, and everything in between. This is brought to you by Enterprise Knowledge. I'm Zach Wahl, founder and CEO of EK, and today we're speaking with Bryan Yee, Director of Knowledge Management at Amgen. Bryan, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, if you've listened before, I always like to lead off by asking our guests to define knowledge management. I'm always interested to hear how you describe KM.
This is especially relevant for me, and we'll probably get into this in the course of our conversation, being that my team is only about 2 years old. And if you do some quick mental math, you realize that our team was born literally at the beginning of the height of the pandemic. And so trying to define knowledge management as we're building a new capability is something that we've been doing quite often. And the way I attempt to do this is I describe it as a felt difference in one's ability to ask better or deeper questions of the right people as quickly and or as easily as possible. And that might differ, I think, from a traditional KM or knowledge management definition if you were to Google it. I start with that and the keyword being a felt difference. Because as I think about my own experience as a consumer of knowledge management products or services, you sometimes question if there is a felt difference or if it is yet that one other thing. And I think if you take this approach or that posture, it fundamentally causes you to ask questions about what is it that you're capturing? What is it that you're curating? What is it that you're creating? And then the second part being, what is your culture? Is your culture in your organization one that causes those things you've captured or curated or created? Is it things that matter? Is it everything? Or is it just the things that want to be seen or we want to have seen? And then you start thinking about the inclusivity of your efforts, the diversity of the voices in the space. And then you get to the capabilities, which can sometimes include technology that dictate how frictionless or how delightful that experience is. And so hopefully those are things that we can dig into today. Those are just the things that come to my mind going back to a simple definition isn't, I think, sufficient for the things that people like us care deeply about.
Nice. Our listeners will hear a feverish scratching there as I was trying to capture all that in notes because there's a lot there that I want to pull apart. So, Bryan, first of all, as soon as I hear the definition of better, deeper connections to the right people, I go to the thought process that you have a very tacit, knowledge centric definition of KM, meaning that it's very much about connecting to experts, learning from people. Do you have that tacit knowledge as the center of KM, or did I misinterpret what I just heard from you?
No, you're right on. When I think about our knowledge sharing and connectivity capabilities within our specific organization, we're always going to need to get better at surfacing explicit knowledge. But I would say that's table stakes. And I think if we focus solely on that, we're missing the added layer of the people. And if there's maybe one of the few things that I think the last 2 years has heightened our awareness and our understanding of, it's the importance of the people who bring that context to the table. And so I also always describe it as I don't think we need to choose, but I think we underappreciate often what it takes to surface that tacit knowledge, as you mentioned. And I go back, this is where concepts such as psychological safety come in. Does your organization promote the fact that our learnings from potentially our errors, or what I would say more importantly, the things that almost went wrong, does your culture incentivize that? Does your culture not just incentivize that, but promote and celebrate that? If I were to ask a handful of staff members if they felt that they would not be seen differently for openly engaging in dialogue around the thing that almost went wrong outside of the safe team environment, and you could define that in a number of ways, I don't think we'd be surprised by the answer. But then at the same time, I go, if that is the current state, that's something that we can work with. And when you bring that adjacent to explicit knowledge, which you can ask anybody, how's your enterprise search doing? And you get a lot of responses. I would say we've got to be moving these priorities in parallel. And if I'm honest, when I talk to a lot of my peers in knowledge management, a lot of us are struggling with prioritization of funding and so forth. And so the big enterprise builds in 2022, they may or may not be going forward, but you always can be making progress when it comes to developing culture because if we're honest, developing culture isn't a 6-month project. It's an ongoing investment. And when you think about how staff members in an organization interpret culture, it's that ongoing observation of what I would call the stars in the constellation. And if every project is a star in that constellation, that's not one star. Yes, you'll have that North Star. That analogy breaks down quickly. I think about it as it's every experience that they have throughout their day. It's the projects they see being invested in. It's the reactions that people are having to when people bravely share something. It's the interpretation of all of those different experiences that then reinforce, build, and scale a culture that I believe is one where you can begin to realize your competitive advantage, which is your talent and the knowledge that's within them.
Couple follow-up questions here. And the first, Brian, is you mentioned the reason people don't share knowledge, right? And we've run all the surveys, and one of the top reasons is always fear. It's fear of saying the wrong thing or being embarrassed or admitting that you were wrong or, to your point, admitting that you failed. So, how do you begin to remove that? Because as you say, it's not a 6-month project. It's effectively an ongoing endeavor where you always just trend towards better if you're doing it right. So, how do you begin that process? How do you get people comfortable saying, I screwed up? Let me share that. That's not a comfortable place in a lot of organizations.
Absolutely not. And I think this is where, when we think about knowledge management initiatives, for lack of better words, I've resigned to the fact of saying that there will be a big knowledge management initiative that I'm going to be leading. But I think about how do I bring the disciplines of knowledge management into the things that matter to an organization at the current time. And so, specifically, right now, one of the things that our organization, as many are thinking about, is questions about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And something that I'm very proud that our organization has been investing energy and time into, as I mentioned a moment ago, psychological safety. And so when you think about psychological safety, the ability to share and speak up without fear of that being held against you, Amy Edmondson has a much better definition that I probably should have just read, to be honest. Maybe we can edit that in at some point to make it sound like I
I,
said it the
I
first
think
time.
yours was great. I liked it.
But what we've done is we've come alongside those efforts. There's an incredible amount of energy around thinking about how a culture of psychological safety actually fosters simply inclusion and belonging, which are the right things, but also creates an environment that's right for innovation. And within Amgen, we are a large biopharmaceutical company that's working on therapies that can help people who are suffering from grievous diseases. Innovation is important to us because it allows us to bring these medicines to patients who are waiting for them more quickly. And so, if we desire to have an organization that thinks innovatively, that doesn't just go on with what's been done in the past, but thinks about how we can push the boundaries in a way that brings medicines to patients more quickly, we have to have a culture that enables that. And so our team is lending its full support to say, well, how do we become a part of fostering that culture? Because we know it pays dividends in the spaces that I've described, but it's also essential in a knowledge sharing and discovery culture. We believe that as we continue to come alongside the organization on an area of focus at this point in time that matters, this isn't a knowledge management project. And I think as knowledge leaders, we have to think about our initiatives in that vein. Yes, there will be the large technology implementation projects when we're afforded that opportunity. But when it comes to creating a culture that helps facilitate and more importantly nurtures mindsets that understand not just that it's important to share, that I should
Mhm.
share, but that I should share the things that matter and that I should ensure that it's not just the same three voices sharing over and over again. You think about inclusion and so for that space, that's a way that we can begin to crack that nut. Now, is that going to knock it out of the park? No, but I think that's something that I think about the past, once again, year or two for my team. I think the best compliment I got recently was, is all this work we're doing in diversity, inclusion, belonging, is that now merged with knowledge management? I said, I love that question.
Blend those lines, right? Yes, that's
Yeah,
great.
exactly. Yeah. There shouldn't be these lines, right?
I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just said, but I'm going to toddler method you here a little bit. How do you change the psychological safety of an organization? How do you change the culture? Are you leading by example? Are you teaching classes? Are you providing job aids? What are you doing?
Yeah, everything that you just mentioned, there's a lot of that being delivered through some of the central efforts to change the culture from are we aware of what this means? Are we aware of what it looks like? But I think as if you ask any knowledge management leader, training is never the end of anything. And so the next step is how do you then help staff see that applied? And so specifically for us, a place that we've been investing in is we've said, okay, if we are beginning, and I'm not gonna say we are experiencing fully, but if we're beginning to experience psychological safety, and someone is ready to be that first courageous person to share something, have we created pathways to reduce the friction to sharing? And one of the challenges that I think a lot of staff face in organizations is what is the best way to share? And if I do share, do I have high confidence that it'll be seen, reused, appreciated? We just touched on elements of technology, process, and culture there. And so this is where our team kind of parachuted in and said, hey, we can do something here. And so one area that we've applied the concept of psychological safety, sharing things that matter, is in how we do lessons learned. And we've pivoted the experience to say this isn't so much your traditional lessons learned of we've got a big workshop, sticky dots, PowerPoint templates, and a facilitator. Because truth be told, oftentimes lessons learned are saved for the end of a big project. In our world in drug development, these clinical trials, which is where our team is focused on in knowledge management, clinical trials are long endeavors. Think of a clinical trial as a long project with multiple decision points, high investment and resource commitment. And the decisions you make early on are ones that you watch play out over a period of time. And so if you can bring together the collective wisdom and knowledge of your learnings, you can inform, we believe, people with different experiences they would not have otherwise had when they are making their own respective decisions. And so on the flip side, if you wait till the end of each of these programs, this could be up to 10 years long, the collective set of programs. And so I always ask the question, is the lesson learned after 10 years still applicable now to those going through it? And so what our team has done is we said, how do we create a culture of storytelling? Going back to, we believe that drug developers are learning every day. But we said, what if we can get into the flow of these 10-year programs when something significant happens? And so we have a content strategy. What are the topics that matter to drug developers? And as we see topics in that space bear out, now this is where we pair it with the concept of psychological safety. Was that a high five story? Like we did something amazing. Or was it oh, it didn't go how we thought it would. Let's try to rewind and figure that out. But then they go back and realize oftentimes the teams are way too busy. Or on top of that, even if they have the time, they don't have the level of confidence that it's going to get seen and reshared. So that's where our team has come in both a storytelling capability, which is not about creating a 20-page PowerPoint deck, but it's like a short synopsis. It's a one-page blog-ish. What was the overview, key takeaways? Then more importantly, tie it back to the people who had that experience and all the other things that you traditionally would have gotten first port of call. Typically we're quick to send PowerPoints around, but PowerPoints don't tell the story. And so we've created the wrapper of the story tied to the content or the topics that matter that connected to the people and the things. And then we use our platform to ensure that they're shared. And the secret sauce that comes on top of this all is that the team of storytellers we have, because we're a very small team, is we've created a career development opportunity for staff to volunteer 10% of their time, knowing that we'll invest time in them to make them good storytellers. And so we have a lot of tips and tricks in terms of when you go and interview someone about their story, we guarantee you that they're going to share in generalities. We're trained to do that as corporate humans. That your learning is plan earlier and work together. That applies to everything. First, express gratitude for them being vulnerable, but then ask the good follow-up and just make an educated guess. Guess what the earlier time point was, because then the natural human response will be to correct. And all of a sudden, what you've done there is you've subtly trained someone on how to share knowledge. You've actually captured the knowledge that matters. And now you have a pathway to surfacing it on our platform that will hopefully then connect it to the right people at the right time, just the right amount of detail, because we'll teach you how to write tight. Then to the person, going back to our conversation on the tacit connections, and then all the things, the explicit things. But then once again, doing this for stories that matter, promoting psychological safety to say, hey, when I see something that wasn't the high five story, my role as a leader is to try to pave the way for that story to come out. And as more and more of those come out and are connected to people, we begin to demonstrate that we're serious about this. So that's the secret sauce, right, Zach? We can talk about it, but if we don't do something, it is never felt.
It sounds like you're creating some really compelling content. So I want to pull at this a little bit to make sure that I understand, that our listeners will understand. So it sounds like you've got a core team who is leading these interviews, but also teaching others within the business how to lead them as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's an aspect of that. And so we have a small team, four of us, and I have one person that serves as a program manager, if you will, for our storytelling capability. And then we have 15 people across research and development at Amgen that have raised their hand and we said, hey, do you want to join us in creating a culture of storytelling?
And that's those 10% of their time folks.
Exactly, that volunteer group. And I think the powerful thing there, going back to, this isn't just, hey, we're going to train you and send you off. We are dead serious about saying this is going to be a career development opportunity. We're going to take someone from the research organization and say, here are all the learnings that we see brewing across areas outside of your discipline. And we're purposely going to help you pick ones that will expand your network, expand your understanding of what it takes to bring a drug to market. Because in drug development, while it's important to understand your discipline and your area of focus, we believe that the more you understand those concentric circles outside of there helps you become a better drug developer on both ends. The person doing the job, but as you interact with others, those networks get created. So it goes back to like the output of this is that encapsulation of an experience that gets surfaced on a platform and gets connected. But so much is happening in the interplay of the creation of these, which is it's a culture play, if I'm perfectly honest, at the end of the day, because people are learning about one another, they're learning about what one another does, and those connections are multiplying over time.
Very cool. Now, my sense of this is that you somehow have gotten folks almost in the habit of recognizing when a story needs to be told. Because to your point, I mean, if one of the efforts is 10 years long, waiting to the end, first of all, the knowledge will fly out of the organization, people's heads in those 10 years. But secondly, you miss a lot of opportunities to apply that knowledge if you're waiting that long to actually codify it. How have you provided people a guide to what those right moments are? We refer to them internally as high value moments of knowledge capture. Like something's happened that makes me say, this is something that we want to get down on paper.
Yeah. So right now, it's primarily been more on the side of through the relationships that our team is building with various groups. And so we spend a lot of time, I wouldn't say it's necessarily doing education, but we do some simple socialization. And it actually is first pegged on let us share with your organization what we've seen so far. And we've had enough grassroots sharing, if you will. And this goes back to we want to, from a cultural perspective, reward and recognize those who have already stepped up. And so there's an element of, first of all, starts off with, I'd like to share with this XYZ leader in the organization, the people that are showing up. I believe specifically in the type of work that we're doing is that we're surfacing the voices that are maybe not your usual suspects. And I want you to know that you've got some amazing people in your organization. But then I take that opportunity to say, hey, by the way, I bet there's more. And I want you to also realize that what we did in surfacing that learning that came out of your organization, that came at very little cost to you. Going back to our approach is we don't send the team a template. We don't sign them up for a 3-hour workshop and give them a bunch of work. We literally say, hey, we heard something happened in this space and we want to help make sure that we surface that from your team's collective genius so that it can benefit others. When people kind of hear that preamble, they go, yeah, of course, why would I not want to do that? Especially when we say, on top of that, do not bring anything. One of our team members is going to reach out. We're going to set 30 minutes and we just want to talk. All you got to do is show up. And from time to time, they'll punt that 30-minute meeting. That's the reality. But once it happens, the part that I'm so excited about is after those conversations, and this has happened more than one time, the person sharing it goes, thanks for the opportunity to share that. I haven't had the time or the space. And this goes back to in any large organization, many teams have these large quarterly all hands meetings. There's usually like a internal case study share or something. And I go back to there are more than 4 exciting things happening each year in our organization.
We've all been there too. Those are the meetings where there's always rose colored glasses, and they always tend to spend a lot of time on what happened really, really well and really to plan, and not so much on where things didn't. So now you've just hit on another reason why knowledge doesn't get shared because it's too hard. And you describe the process where you're making it really easy. You're only asking for 30 minutes of somebody's time. And if I were to guess, I'd say that your team is also doing call it the production of that piece of content. You're doing the writing, you're making it look pretty, you're publishing it. Am I inferring correctly there?
Absolutely. Yep.
Great. So then let's talk about the third reason that I see why people don't naturally share knowledge. So we've talked about because there's a fear-based piece of this, meaning that somebody doesn't want to say something that's embarrassing or that they'll get in trouble for. People don't share knowledge because it's too hard, it takes too much time, the technology doesn't support it, or whatever else. The third one that I see a lot is that knowledge is power. People don't want to share their knowledge because they're knowing it and somebody else not knowing it makes them critical to the organization. Have you run into that? And if so, how have you confronted it?
I'm sure I've run into it, but not explicitly. I'd be naive to say that there is not at least one person who feels that way. Now, has that person, if they exist, stated that to my face? No. But I think I counter that with the notion of it's a constellation of stars that describe a culture. When you have an organization as large as Amgen or any large company, there will always be someone who operates out of fear or maybe has that perspective. If that was the majority of your organization, I think it'd be a different problem. But I see it as I can create enough bright, shining stars with what we're doing to make that the minority voice as opposed to the majority. And as that constellation of experiences of people sharing things that matter, making connections grows brighter and brighter, that becomes the culture that wins.
And you used a couple important words. You talked about reward and recognize. Have you seen the shift happening? Maybe when you begun this a couple of years ago, there was a little bit more trepidation, maybe people weren't quite as forthcoming, and now they've shifted. They recognize the fact that bosses want to see this, and this is something that folks are getting kind of patted on the back for in the organization. Have you seen the momentum?
The momentum that we've seen is coming from the volume of work that's coming our way. And this is where, if I were to kind of reveal my long-term strategy, is that while we currently operate with these people who specifically raise their hand and say, I volunteer, and a little more detail on that is the way it works within Amgen, our R&D organization, is we have the specific rotational program that people can volunteer a part of their time. So I'm one of the folks that, hey, I've got a volunteer role, career development purposes, here's what it looks like. It's described as a 6 month, 10% volunteer commitment, if you will, to say, I will be a part of the storytelling team. I will share that out of those 15 people that we've had join, 13 of them have continued on indefinitely, saying, you know what, it's over, but I want to stay on. Those people have gone from being the ones who are capturing the story to they're also helping to source the stories. And I've told each of them, I said, hey, in a year or two, sometime down the road, we're going to shut down this volunteer thing because this is just going to become part of the fabric of our organization. My team focuses on the platform and some of the more forward looking stuff that supports our strategies around personalization and delivering knowledge in the flow because we've created a organic content engine that realizes that anybody can do this. Right now we're incubating this culture of storytelling as a starting point. It's a curation and creation play. But then there also is explicit knowledge in the things that are created in the course of work. And then you think about the ability to layer on data science approaches like machine learning and natural language processing to surface unstructured content connected to a knowledge graph, and then allow broader experiences like enterprise search or the ability to connect concepts to one another and traverse knowledge apart from knowing which system report to connect. That's the future that we're building towards. But we've almost opportunistically stumbled on this notion of how do we help people realize this matters? And I'm actually kind of glad that we ended up here. We actually ended up here not by mistake, but by a set of circumstances that caused us to take our focus off of a technology project to a culture project, given funding constraints. But I'm actually really glad where we're at because it's building a cultural foundation that is going to pave the way for an appreciation of what we do and then ensure that what we do is focused on the things that matter. Going back, it's do we have a culture of psychological safety that enables us to share everything, not just the high five stories?
There's another key point to this, though, right? I mean, knowledge graphs are super cool if you've got the right content for them to connect. And what
Exactly.
you are doing is effectively creating really a rich source of content that you can then link to your data and to your explicit content and to your learning content. But this is a huge piece of the puzzle that would have been otherwise missing. Where is it today, though? I mean, I'm always curious how you are delivering this, right? Because this content sounds wonderful. How does the average Amgen employee find it, discover something they didn't know they should go looking for? How's that work?
So we've got our content creation engine specifically in the storytelling space. It's cranking something out on a weekly basis at this point. And we have become known for like there is something coming from the knowledge team, that quick 3 to 5 minute read that then connects me to new people on a weekly basis. That we use the Microsoft suite, so SharePoint and Yammer are the primary ways of distributing those things. And I always joke, I think we found the first business use for Yammer. I think we talked to a lot of organizations. Yammers, they giggle when you say Yammer, and it's where people share pictures of their pets. We do that too.
Birthday announcements, recipes.
Yeah, the things that people just kind of ignore. But it's been a place where we've actually gained traction. And the part that excites me the most is not just the metrics that we see on the back end because it's trending in all the right directions, but it's the phone calls that I get from leaders. And it's a phone call that I get from a leader on a drug development program that goes, "Hey Brian, we just had a strategic conversation and one of the stories that the team shared was brought in, and that was very helpful. Thank you guys for doing that." Or I get a call from someone who was interviewed for a story who was, if I'm perfectly honest, a little skeptical on why we were doing this. He goes, "I get it now. That was worth my time." And I go back, those are the things that go, okay, we're marching in the right direction when you see that happen. And so that's now going on a weekly basis in terms of our delivery. We also do a number of things. I know we've talked extensively about our work in storytelling, but we see topics that are of big enough size. We develop what I call, for lack of better words, master classes that are like 20-minute, find the right person in the organization with that depth of experience to like do like a master class on that topic. This is independent of training. This is not our controlled documents. This is like the mindset training. So we marry that also up to the stories, because you might have this master class on some aspect of designing a trial, and then you have the learning or the story that's related to that. And for those of us who think in knowledge graphs and so forth and taxonomies, you see the relationships that are starting to form. You also have these things that are, for lack of better words, kind of like expert managed wikis that follow that topical concept. And this builds our platform, our ecosystem. It's all hosted in SharePoint that we're delivering on. But throughout the year, we're continuing to add and create and curate and invite people into being a part of this content curation and creation strategy that is continuing to grow, while on the back end, we're developing the metadata and the taxonomies and ultimately also the relationships and knowledge graphs to think about how we go from this weekly, hey, here's something we learned, to, hey, Zach, you're on this type of drug development program, which is at this point in time and has these nuances or characteristics. And we realize that because it's at this point in time, these are the questions you should be asking. And if you're not, here they are, and here are the learnings, and here are the things that can help you, and more importantly, the people you can work with. And that's the future we're building towards. Going back to, I think you said before, we're building this rich bed of content that we're either creating directly or becoming aware of, with the eventual play of delivering a more personalized approach to helping people in the work that they're doing.
I wanted to hear how you were thinking about the future and how you were going to structure that. And it sounds like what you're doing is you're basically taking this wonderful process of creating knowledge and you're learning from the words that people are using, the ways that they're describing these lessons learned, and you're actively putting that into your taxonomy and ontology information structures now, so that when you do get to the knowledge graph or you do get to the fancy whiz bang tool, you're going to have the right architecture in place to make it all findable and discoverable and connected in all the right ways. Am I getting that right?
You must have seen the master plan. That's exactly kind of what we're thinking about. Yeah.
But that's really powerful because I think too many organizations say, okay, now we need to do taxonomy, or now we need to do ontology, or now we're going to put it into a new tool. But by doing it in concert, by actually creating new content, really generating new knowledge, at the same time thinking about how people would want to interact with that knowledge, how they'd want to be able to find it and learn from it, you're doing it in context. You're doing it in a way that's going to be really a lot easier for the average employee, layperson to understand and to use. It's a great approach. I really like it. Talk to me a little bit more about that target state. How far down the roadmap do you think you are to the point where you deliver that true knowledge at the point of need? I don't know how many of our listeners are old enough to remember the choose your own adventure books from when you were a kid that you would kind of flip to a certain page to figure out how the story goes. But that's what I'm picturing as you describe this. Somebody goes looking for an answer and they get to choose, well, I want the lesson learned, or I want the master class, or I want to take the training, or I want the manual. Like, you're basically going to be giving them a menu of options of how they want to embrace the learning, the knowledge, the information.
Yeah, I think that's one element. I might push it one step further and say within our organization, and I think this should ring true to any organization that manages large projects. There is a master database of milestones and events related to each one of your large projects. And likely in another system, there's going to be a database of the role everyone plays on those projects. And I think that first nuance is their role versus their title in the organizational hierarchy. At Amgen, we work in a cross-functional setting. So you go to your HR system, that doesn't show you the role they're playing. It shows you who signs their time card, essentially. So you have to find another way to source that data. But what quickly happens is you have a lot of systems that will tell you who is working on what and when that thing they're working on is in your large product development lifecycle. And so we think about that from the perspective of, I don't need to wait for you to go and ask a question. I can actually flip it around and say, these are the points and times that are critical that we've learned from. You should have the access to the knowledge and the connections at this point in time for us to increase, hopefully, the probability that you make the best informed decision with the things that are available to you, while still striking the balance of way too much noise. And I think this is heightened specifically in our current environment. You look back at whatever you want to call it, the great resignation. Companies are faced with staff that are entering companies with increasing levels of responsibilities because of the seniority of their role that they're coming into without the rich, if you will, benefit of a long standing developed network of knowledge and connections. And so the need for the ability to not wait for someone to ask the question, they're still going to ask questions, but to supplement, I say, at this point in time, here's some key things that we've learned that we think you should be aware of. And then to your point then, Zach, and here's, the list of options for all the things that we can go down. We've got a couple of experiments in that space right now. We haven't gotten to the point of full automation. We're designing our first personalized nudges that are focused down to the role level. Going back to, we've moved from everybody gets everything. It's like, all right, we're focusing on a couple of key personas, which then goes back to, we've got to focus on persona research to figure out what their key needs are, map that back to what we know so far, figure out the nuance, and then to get feedback to learn from it. Over time, this is where, if we get the scaffolding built up right, this becomes ripe for machine learning. It becomes ripe for learning in the flow. Just to give you another throwback, you talked about the Choose Your Own Adventure book. I really remember those. I've also been accused of creating the next version of Clippy. So if someone remembers Clippy,
Yeah.
in the flow advice, and I said, I will not be Clippy because no one has a positive memory of that.
I wouldn't try to sell the next gen Clippy. I think that that's probably a dead end.
Yeah, I'm avoiding that as much as possible.
I love what you're saying here, though. Earlier in the conversation, talked about high value moments of knowledge capture. It's not just when a project ends, it's when a new member of the team gets onboarded or you hit a project milestone or whatever else. But Brian, what you're talking about is high value moments of knowledge delivery. If your system is intelligent enough to understand the process, to understand the project, and say, hey, you're at this stage, here's some really important information that should benefit you, that should keep you from making the mistakes that others have made in your place. Am I getting
Exactly.
that right?
That's exactly right. I've got a team member, she's done some amazing work where she sat down with experts in the field of drug development and said, what are the questions you should have asked, or you should ask, or you should ask of others? And we went through this mapping exercise, and I forget the exact number, but it was hundreds of questions and resources and tools and people. And the reality is that single individual having to be their own knowledge curator for all of that. Or in traditional corporate settings, we've built a playbook or a portal or another thing. And this is where I go back to the promises of the knowledge graph, I think, are going to help us alleviate this, knowing which portal system, this need to know the internal taxonomy of an organization. It allows us to traverse the knowledge graph more seamlessly in more layperson terms, if you will. We're not there yet. But to your point, we can't sell that with it, but we've got to create a felt experience today. And so for us, the strategy has been to create a couple of nudges manually, deliver them, measure their impact, what the organization's appetite for more, build it on top of content that matters, but that as you build that content that matters, do it in a way that shows extreme gratitude to the people who are volunteering them, and trust that that will build you a foundation for that next project and that next project and that next project.
So many large KM initiatives are rife with an overly long and complex timeline. It takes too long to show value. And so, what I really appreciate about your approach and the way you're describing it, Brian, is that you're not asking anybody to wait or to trust you for too long. You're delivering these small points of value. And then that allows you to say, but wouldn't it be cool if there were 1,000 of these? Or wouldn't it be cool if I didn't have to put this in Yammer? Instead, it just got to the right person at the right time. I really like the agile approach that you're taking here. So you've been at Amgen for a while. Can you share with our listeners how you got to where you are now, how you developed this expertise in KM?
Yeah. So actually, just yesterday, I celebrated 16 years full time at Amgen.
Big deal.
And thank
Congratulations.
you. And prior to that, I had the opportunity to intern at Amgen for two consecutive summers. And so I have literally grown up my entire career in the biopharmaceutical industry. And I started my career in IT program management, focusing on deploying large system implementations in the clinical trial space. That's what gave me my first glimpse into the complexity of clinical trials and the opportunity to bring process and technology together to advance that with speed and intelligence. And it was through those range of assignments that then led me to doing process improvement. So that was my quote unquote jump out of IT, focusing on process improvement and business transformation. That then led me to a few other roles, playing a chief of staff role, so focusing on strategy, before my current stint in knowledge management. And what I realized through those assignments over those 16 years was that I was afforded with a broad view of the business. whether it was my focus on systems that can drive forward, clinical trials, helping us, create business intelligence tools to make decisions, or how it was transforming the organization through process optimization or whatnot. But I was always in these what I call spanning roles. And I realized that that was helping me make connections quickly, albeit not depth, but I could ask those better questions of better people more quickly. And I became kind of that knowledge management person thing as opposed to a capability that was democratized. I began to ask the question, like, why do I make those connections quickly? And is there a way to leverage data that already exists in the flow of work versus having to create more trackers? And then I thought back to my systems experiences, realizing the data exists already. It's messy, but what is data not messy? But then also again through my roles as a chief of staff, focusing on strategy in organizational development, is our culture aligned to those things? And so I kind of stumbled onto knowledge management. And if I'm honest, looking back on my career, I was kind of weaving it into my work because it helped me do work better. And I think for a lot of us, we realize that we've been doing knowledge management longer than we knew. There are those who go through formal education for this, which I think both of those are needed in this space. And so I've got a blend of those skills on my team now. But I stumbled upon this about 2.5 years ago, where we're at a pivot point in our organization where we said we've been investing in creating innovation capabilities, but how's it going to endure? And the organization said we need to build a knowledge management capability, and that's when I had the opportunity to say, let's go build that team and let's deliver on that.
So that answers my next question. You pitched the creation of the role that you're playing now.
I would say, yeah, I would say I was a part in pitching that creation. I think there was an appreciation by the leadership that knowledge management was something that was needed, but it was one of those things where you go, well, what do we mean by that? And so I got to be a part of that. Well, here's what it could mean, and here's what I think it should mean. And then as time went on, the opportunity was afforded for me to step into that role and lead the creation of that, which I've had the privilege of doing for the past 2 years.
So exciting. Now, and you had mentioned that your team is about 2 years old. You've got a COVID team. How are you now tracking the path forward? You are doing very cool things. I hear the enthusiasm in your voice around where you want to take this. Do you have a sense of timeline? What's the roadmap look like?
Yeah, so the roadmap for us is continuing to grow in our, what I would say now is our digital side of the capabilities. We're never going to take our foot off the pedal when it comes to building culture because that isn't, as we said before, something you're never done with. But the next step is going to be how do we scale this capability and how do we democratize the connections that our team is helping to make, in discrete single learnings. And this is where we've kind of touched on this in a moment ago, our investments in building out the knowledge graph, but then more importantly, familiar experiences on top of a knowledge graph. I think that's been one of the key things that's been missing in a lot of large technology implementations is we built a new tool that you now need to know when to come to and go to. We see the knowledge graph as powering those personalized nudges that'll show up in whatever form that you operate in, whether it's the email. Let's be honest, Outlook isn't going away as much as knowledge should not be transferred through Outlook, but a personalized nudge via Outlook will be an experience that isn't a new system anyone needs to be trained on. Partnering with enterprise search is a key strategy for us, knowing that search is a familiar muscle for so many. So, how can a knowledge graph improve the connections that are made in search? Because we know in our personal lives, our first Google search isn't the last, but the results inform the next search. Or the visibility of a knowledge panel, which is driven by a knowledge graph, helps us then go down a different path to explore. And so, we're investing in those experiences across the board. I see our roadmap as investing in enabling those, creating rich connections through those, but then also continuing to expand the breadth of knowledge that we are capturing, creating, and curating. I mentioned before, we're focused in the clinical trial space, in a biopharmaceutical. That's the D of R&D. But I often tell people because they ask me, "Oh, so what department do you support?" I always cheekily give a vague answer, say, "Oh, we support drug developers." And they go, "Oh, which department is that?" I say, "That's not a department. That's something that Amgen does." And I will continue to be vague in that space because our organizational structure does not marry up with the type of knowledge that matters. And we bleed around the edges. And so I think part of the roadmap is continuing to bleed further and further and further as more and more people catch a whiff of what we're up to, which, part of it is, it's happening organically, but part of the roadmap is to start going out there and pushing it. But we want to get it right. We want to make sure that the work that we do isn't creating undue burden on people, but also that it's creating, and I hate to use a buzzword, but it's creating delight. That people are going, yeah, that was worth it. That was worth spending 30 minutes with Brian's team to share my knowledge because, oh my goodness, people are benefiting from it. The phone calls I get, the phone calls that my team gets saying someone reached out. Those are the moments that we live for, and we want to scale that to as much as the corporation as we can.
And there's that felt difference that you led
Absolutely.
with. Now, I want to go back to your mention of knowledge graphs because I think you made an important point that maybe some of our listeners have mistaken. Knowledge graph can be its own platform that has its own face, as in, for some organizations, they're going to build a user interface on top of a knowledge graph. That's how you're going to ask questions, that's how you're going to search, that's how you're going to do this or that. You're describing it in a way that I think is actually more flexible, and we're seeing a lot of traction. The knowledge graph isn't necessarily its own front end, it's the thing that improves a lot of the front ends that you already have. It creates a delivery mechanism through your existing email. It creates enhanced search through knowledge panels and better search weighting. Maybe it's assembling new content that's going to show up as content items in your portal or intranet. So, for a listener's perspective, I really want to hit that point really hard. Can you go back to that and specifically share? Have you figured out what comes first, or are you still in the pre tech phase of just kind of planning, and in the future, you're going to hit more of the design and implementation stuff?
Yeah, so we're in the midst of it as we speak right now. We've gone back to our story of the past 2 years. People get that we're up to something, just to be overly general. And so we embedded ourselves into teams that are working on, once again, large projects. I go back to, I'm not going to be kicking off a KM project anytime soon. I've embedded my team members into corporate priorities that would have otherwise gone and done a business intelligence work stream as a part of that large initiative. We've said, we'll come alongside you to give you some free extra resource. But our incentive in there is to, yes, help you deliver that report that you're going to build. But we're going to build it on top of something called a knowledge graph. And we're going to use this as an opportunity to map out that domain. And this goes back to, these knowledge graphs aren't going to build themselves overnight. And no one has the patience for if I'm perfectly honest, an academic exercise like that. But when it can deliver felt value in the short term, while slowly becoming the Lego or the building blocks for a even bigger felt experience, that's where it becomes powerful. And that's where my simple one liner, I will never lead with the word knowledge graph, but I'll say, wouldn't it be amazing if one of your staff who is new to the company, that doesn't speak the folksonomy of our organization, because we speak in code and acronyms, but can describe who they're looking for, not using the official title term, but who they're looking for. There's a combination of knowledge graph taxonomy there, and to be connected to that person, wouldn't that be powerful? Absolutely. Said, we're on the road to that. And on top of that, we're not just on the road to that, but we're on the road to that also highlighting that this person has also worked on these things, because the knowledge graph powers that. The knowledge graph knows that people work on things, and that things have attributes, and that things have temporality, a point in time, and that you can allow these experiences, once again, to show up in familiar interfaces like search versus secret portal that has a cute acronym, because that's what we named it as a part of our initiative, that I hope you save the URL to. That doesn't work. Those days are past us.
You're talking about knowledge graphs in terms of personas and use cases, and that is the only way to do it right. So I love hearing that. Can you speak to the technology? What have you chosen? What are you working with?
We're adopting whatever has been adopted at the enterprise level. And so this goes back to, from our knowledge team, we don't position ourselves to own the enterprise technology stack. Amgen goes through its own choices in terms of, this is what will be available. And we focus on leveraging that to the best of our ability. We have no desire to take on the total cost of ownership of those things, but we have a huge interest in ensuring that those things are used in a way that delivers felt value.
Brian, kind of a big question to summarize. What's that one piece of advice that any listener needs to carry forward in their organization to achieve the sorts of successes that you're experiencing at Amgen?
I'll go back to where we started. I think it's focus on delivering that positive, delightful, insert whatever you want to call it, but deliver that felt experience, and realize that that felt experience does not have to come from technology. I think so often KM, knowledge management, and technology are seen as the same, and they are related. And knowledge management capabilities are both technical and non-technical. Put that aside and focus on, what is that felt experience. And I would double down and say, also focus on the felt experience first of those providing the knowledge before those seeking the knowledge. Not saying that you're going to ignore those things, but I think one of the things that has made us successful is the grassroots love for our team. And I'll say the love for our team has come from the fact that the early people that were invited to participate had a very positive felt experience that then made those consuming the knowledge realize that this was done in a way that was extremely thoughtful, and they were then ready to receive the impact of that and then participate.
That is a really powerful takeaway. I think a lot of KM transformations focus a great deal on the need and the eater instead of the feeder. And if that feeder is not having a good experience, if it's not easy and if it doesn't feel safe, then there are going to be a lot more barriers to success than there otherwise would be. I think that's a great takeaway, Bryan. Thank you. Phenomenal. Well, great conversation, pulling in a lot of really, really interesting strings there. So, again, Bryan, thank you so much for the time. To all of our listeners, thanks for joining us. And to check out more on knowledge management, visit us at enterprise-knowledge.com. Have a great day, y'all.